Hello and welcome to this Queen Endgames video. Today I have 5 examples of a queen versus a pawn about to promote. And this video is being made because a viewer mentioned how they have the most trouble with queen endings. So hopefully this helps some, and in the future I could do more of these and expand on these queen endgames. So in this example, it's white to move, and this black pawn is 1 square away from promoting. And if this pawn could promote, the game would be a draw. So for white to try and win, they have to stop this pawn promotion. So how would you do this? We see it takes quite a bit of quite a number of moves to do this, but let's take a look here. So we'll turn on the analysis, and we see that queen to e8 or queen to e7 checks the king. That way the king doesn't have time to promote. And whenever you have a pawn on the 7th rank about ready to promote and you're trying to stop it, there's a big difference in what happens in those endgames, which is determined by where your king is. So this king is way out of play here and not able to help. So that makes all the difference in these end games. So if the king is not able to assist the queen, usually, if that king can help, a lot of times the queen will win, of course. But let's see what happens with the queen out of play here. So the queen checks, the king steps to the side, and another check, and we see the queen is checking and slowly moving closer to the action down here. So king moves, we have another check as the queen gets closer, and then the king just steps to the side back and forth, and the queen is slowly moving in on this pawn. So as the queen gets closer, we see finally the queen can make contact with the pawn, and the king is forced to protect this pawn. Now, what you're trying to do is force the king in front of the pawn so the pawn cannot promote, and that gives you time to step your king closer to the action and assist with the win here. So if you're trying to stop the pawn, 2 ways that you might be able to do that is to force the king in front of the pawn, or even better, if you could get your queen in front of the pawn, well then that gives you time, all the time in the world, to march your king down and help pick that pawn off. So the game continues with a check, and finally the king is in front of the pawn. So that gives us a move to bring our king closer, and the game continues with the king just stepping to the side. And now the queen pins this pawn to the king here. And so the pawn cannot promote. So the king steps forward, getting ready to promote that pawn. So we have to check. And now the king just steps off to the side, and the pawn is under attack again. So the pawn has to be protected. And once again, we see this pattern of checking the king while making contact with the pawn, and the only move to protect the pawn is to get in front of it. And then that gives white time to get that king closer. So the king steps off to the side. We have another pin. King moves down, another check. King just steps off to the side, and the pawn is under attack. So once again, this prevents the pawn from promoting, attacks the pawn, and forces the opponent to protect. And then you can check here, checking the king and making contact with the pawn, forcing the king in front of the pawn once again, and white can move closer to the action here. So the game continues with this pattern repeating, pinning the pawn. The king steps down. We have a check. King moves to the side. The pawn is attacked, protected, and once again, checking the king with contact on the pawn and forcing the king to step in front, and we move our king forward. And so this game ends with the king stepping up, trying to prevent white from getting closer. But we have a check here, now protected by the king. And the king has to step in front. The king moves forward, threatening a mate in one here. So the king just steps off to the side, but now the pawn is captured here. And the game just ends with king to b1 and mate. So an interesting endgame there, and it shows you, how it can be tricky in these queen endgames and what it takes to bring your king into the action, and that makes all the difference in these endgames. If the king is away from the action, then the side that has the pawn has more of a chance to get a draw out of the game. But once that king gets into the action, then the queen many times will win. All right, let's take another look at some more of these end games. I have 4 more examples, and we'll try and get through those here. Let's see. The second one. All right, what do you do here? It's white's turn to move again, and we have a rook pawn, and often those end in draws. And of course it ends in a draw here, and I'll show you what happened. But there is actually a way to win, once again, if that king is close to the action. And I'll show you that in the final 5th example of how white could win against the rook pawn. But we'll see here how it ends in a draw. We have white to move, check. The king steps to the side, and the pawn is attacked here. So of course black defends the pawn from white's attack. And then we have this check. The king steps in to the corner here, and it's in a stalemated position. So now, because of this stalemated position, the white king cannot step closer. Now we saw earlier, if there was room for the king to step to the side and it wasn't a rook pawn, well then that king could try and step off to the side after this king moves forward. But because of the rook pawn, the king is just trapped in the corner here, and the king cannot make progress to help in the attack here. So what is the other option? We have a check, or a check here, but the king would just step out, on the b file here. All right, so that is an example of how this could end in a draw with the rook pawns. So generally speaking, if you have a rook pawn on either side or a bishop pawn, those games end or have a chance of ending in a draw a lot more often than knight or center pawns. So if you have pawns in the center, the D or E pawn or the B or G pawn, white is more likely to win those games and be able to capture the pawn and end up winning. But black has a lot more chance for a draw if it's a rook pawn or one of these bishop pawns on the C or F file. All right, on to the next example here. Let's see. All right, number 3, we have white to move again, and here as an example is one of these bishop pawns. So, what can white do here? So we have a check. The king steps to the side, not moving in front of the pawn and giving time for that king to move forward. So an attack on the pawn. And now we have the king protecting, queen attacking. But here is what makes the difference in these bishop pawn endings here against the queen. the king can step into the corner. And this looks crazy at first, but if the pawn is captured, well, then it's a stalemate because the king cannot move but is not under check. If the king moves forward, well, then it's a stalemated position for the king, but the pawn would be able to promote here. So, this is an interesting example where these bishop pawns on the 7th rank can cause a stalemate when the king goes into the corner here. All right, let's take a look at another example, number 4 here. All right, now we have the bishop pawn, but it's a win for white. Why? Because the king is much closer to the action, and this can make all the difference in the world if the king is able to assist the queen. So here we have king to f3, and what happens now? Interesting move. We have a promotion of the pawn with check, but this leads to a mate. So, what does the computer even recommend? Nothing. Once that king moves forward here, and it looks like there's even a win if the king moves to f4. But, why wouldn't you just move closer? So, if we have this here, now there's a threat of mate in 2, capturing the pawn, and then chasing the king into the corner and mating on on g2. So we have a promotion, but the game is lost. Only if white moves to g3, which makes sense, and we'll see why here. So king to g3, and what can black do here now? There's a threat of queen to h2 mate here. And the only way to stop that is move the queen. If you try to check, there's a capture with mate. If you move the queen here, of course, the king will just capture. What else can you do? You can't move here and check, or the queen will be captured. Wherever this queen moves, there's a threat of a mate here. And so either there's a mate or the queen is lost. So interesting endgame, and something to remember in case you come across this in your own games. A way where once that king gets closer, there are more options that allow a win. All right. So the final example, we go back to a rook pawn and a way to win against the rook pawn. So we see that once again, the king has to be closer to the action here. So this pawn is about to promote with white to move. You definitely want to start checking here. And it says that king to a3 is the way to last the longest. The only problem with that is once you play king to a3, this queen could just move here to d4, preventing the king from moving down to protect the queening square, and also preventing the pawn from moving forward, or it'll just be captured. So maybe we'll take a look at that. But before we do, let's show you what could happen if the king moves here. Now it's in a stalemated position, so we definitely don't want to move the king closer, or that would be a stalemate. So check, king moves away, check, stalemated position once again, check, and we see the queen is just moving closer. The king moves, and now a mate here. So an interesting way where the game, ends in a mate, even with the rook pawn. So if we go back to the beginning, and after check, here apparently there's a mate in 17, which might give your opponent time to make a mistake, but let's see what happens here. Here the recommendation is queen to a5 check or queen to d4. I would recommend queen to d4 because now the king cannot move down here to help protect the pawn. The king could move here, but the queen is controlling the promotion square. The pawn can't promote or it'll just be captured. So then what? King to b3 looks to be the best move, but now we have queen to a1, just stopping the promotion once and for all. So king back to a3, but this allows queen to c3, forcing the king away, and now the pawn is just captured. So, that is why you have to be careful if you're trying to stop this pawn. Let me go back to the beginning. If you can control the queening square, now if we immediately played queen to d4, they could play this king to b1 move, but it looks like that leads to an even quicker mate. Once again, the computer recommends moving away, but then the queen will grab, move down to a1 and just control that queening square. All hopes of promoting are gone. So king to b1, even that does not look good because we have, let's see, queen to d3, or check here, king in the corner, check, and once again, this just allows this mate trapping the opponent's king here. All right, well, feel free to leave any comments. Hopefully I'll do more of these queen end games in the future because they are pretty tricky, and there's a lot more to them than what it looks like, at first glance. So leave comments. Let me know what you think. Also, please like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.